Hi, everyone, and welcome to the fifth session of this new season of the Plan D series of what to do after the PhD that the Comparative Literature Institute has been running since last year. Today, our guest is a former colleague of mine, Stephan Ehrig. He is still currently at University College Dublin, but he's going to relocate to the University of Glasgow very soon. He got a new job. He's assistant professor. Congratulations, sir.
Thank you.
I'm going to just read a short bio that Stephan has up on the UCD webpage, and then he'll kick it off with a nice slideshow that he very kindly prepared for us today. So he was recently an Irish Research Council postdoctoral fellow working on a project entitled Socialist Space and Modernism in East German Literature and Visual Culture. His project argues that socialist space is a major category of GDR fictional culture at the intersection of architecture, literature, and visual culture. It demonstrates how post-war modernist architecture and urban planning used international modernism to create a communist society, and reveals how this provoked a critical counter-reflection in literature and film. Ultimately, it argues that the concept of socialist space uncovers the dichotomy between an idealized space for utopian political and personal opportunities and criticism of the underwhelming architectural and societal status quo. In doing so, it will make, this is still Stephan's description of his project. In doing so, it will make a major interdisciplinary contribution to German and film studies, and eventually can be developed into an international modern languages research cluster, gathering cultural responses to modernist architecture from the 5 continents. Before going to Ireland, Stephan was a teaching fellow in German at Durham University and a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Modern Language Research at the University of London. His PhD project at the University of Bristol dealt with the reception of German early 19th century author Heinrich von Kleist in literature and theater of the German Democratic Republic. Welcome, Stephan, and feel free to begin your presentation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me and the kind invitation and allowing me to talk tonight. And thanks for the kind introduction as well. Yes, I thought like to basically kick it off. I'd kind of run through a couple of slides with a few ideas that kind of like I thought would be worth talking about, and then we can see if we want to talk about them or not. Can you see those?
Yeah.
Just put them. Do you see just the big one, or do you see my directorial one?
I see everything. Right. So okay. I see. Yeah.
This is better, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so I thought like in terms of kind of thinking about an academic career after the PhD, or perhaps not, but in terms of if an academic career is the path to go, just kind of like a few general tips in order kind of like what to expect from life after the PhD. And the first obvious thing would probably be to kind of like, even quite early on in the PhD, perhaps kind of get used to the idea of thinking of a new project fairly early on, because similar to the PhD project itself, it's just something that takes a while and takes a lot of reflection, and is also something that is probably a good thing to leave aside for a bit of time and then come back to it. So kind of like, and the idea I had, and what I personally did and still do actually, is kind of just to have a doc or a folder somewhere on my computer or virtually, where I kind of just collect ideas that I randomly have. And it's like, oh, this is actually interesting. This is an interesting question. Just note it down and make sure you don't forget about it. And then similar, when you kind of come across secondary literature or articles that are actually exactly about that, and you just don't know in that moment what to do with it, just throw it in that folder so that in order to make sure that you actually find it again. And in a sense, like the project that Zhao just read out has come about exactly like that. So I had this idea at a summer school, and then just started developing it over the years while I was still doing my PhD, which kind of is a similar time period, but focused more on theater and literature, and now more working on film and architecture. But even kind of like other things that I'm writing about, just kind of like side ideas that I never had the time to develop thoroughly. You may have the time later on to actually develop these ideas. And lastly, I think even if it's sometimes just an idea, if you apply for jobs and teaching jobs, sometimes what you can do is just pitch these ideas as classes that you would want to be teaching. So so then you don't necessarily have to have them fully developed, but it is something that you can present that is your own idea and kind of showcases things that you're interested in without having to have fully researched it. And sometimes teaching can be a good trial for research project anyway. So that's kind of like how many people would do it. The second big part, obviously, for well, not obviously maybe, but for a new project is also to kind of like find funding for it, because if you mostly do teaching or get teaching jobs, you may not have the time to fully develop a new project. So what the two of us did was apply for postdoc fellowships, and thankfully successfully so in our cases. But that's also something I would encourage everyone who wants to do it to start thinking about early on, and kind of reading up on what's actually out there. So you have like European funders, but you also, there are usually a lot of national funders. Or if you want to take it as an opportunity to go abroad, for instance, have a look at what other countries are offering in terms of these fundings, and also familiarize yourself with what they would require. If they actually, there's usually like an age gap or like a period of time that is fixed after your PhD that you can only be doing these things, and that's something that's good to know so that you can actually make a plan around these things. But also, given that especially in the EU, things tend to become more and more standardized, it also means that many of these applications are getting increasingly similar. So what you can also do if you are flexible or want to be flexible is actually you can recycle these applications across the board, and even kind of like if you don't get it this in a particular year, you can reuse and redevelop the project for another funder the year after. And another trick that doesn't seem to be obvious to many people, which is why I thought I would bring it up. A lot of institutions, so universities, have internal competitions before you can actually apply. So you will have to be nominated by a university to get in. And while you may have a preferred institution, it's advisable to actually submit these things to different institutions and different universities that would technically work for you. To just increase your chances to actually be nominated in the first place, because then you don't want to end up not being nominated at all, because you relied on that one university you really loved to go through. So that's kind of just where you can, and it also means you get different types of feedback and so forth. And yeah, and most importantly probably is actually find reliable and supportive mentors for these kind of projects. So that because you will need a lot of help for all these applications, and you will, once you're doing it, will need a lot of support from research mentors to pull them through, kind of similar to the PhD supervisors, but just on a kind of like grander scale, that then will also include more career advice and support for application writing and these kind of things. And that's why they have to be kind of supportive, but they also have to be reliable. Because having worked for a funder in the meantime as well, it's shocking to see how many applications by postdocs and PhD students are being made ineligible because the mentors actually don't submit their supporting letters, although they've put in all the work in writing the application. So so that's something to definitely check and think about. And that brings me to the next part. So it's any kind of successful application, job application, research grant application requires the literal village of people around you to get it done. And so the next thing is to like start finding your village as early as possible, also because it makes everything more social and more fun. I would add, but kind of like if you have the opportunities to attend these things, go to colloquia, go to workshops, use reading groups that your institution or your departments might have. Depending on the field, there might be PhD conferences. That's something that I did, kind of like national PhD conferences in a specific field where you kind of get to meet PhD students from your field, from all kinds of different universities. And it's useful because you don't only get the chance to present your work in progress to peers, so it's maybe not as scary to start these kind of things compared to going to big conferences where the people you might be quoting and citing are actually present, but actually do it in a more social peer review environment. But also then actually get to know the people you might want to collaborate with and work with, and have these people available for even collaborative writing, which might become more of a thing in the future even, but also for peer review. So like you have a draft of something that you want to send out, and you have like people you trust to get a first opinion, and similar kind of to organize conferences together, to work on research projects, to work on editing projects, or even team teaching, or invite them to your teaching, and etc. So it's part of, for me, it's part of academic culture anyway, but it also helps you to kind of get through challenging times, to have reliable collaborators who then might become good friends as well. So I wouldn't be here without these kind of networks and collaborators. But then in terms of like, it's called Plan D. So like, and we are all aware that the job market is a challenge and is oversaturated and oversubscribed. And irrespective of how much work we might be putting in, there's always the looming opportunity that you might just not get anything, because just out of sheer bad luck. Even so, I would kind of like, I wouldn't say that I was particularly good in doing that, but I think generally it is advisable to think about alternatives to the process as well, and make all kinds of take up available offers. So like most university career offices do classes for free to kind of like both enhance your career opportunities, like CV writing workshops and application training, interview training, and these kind of things, but also like in terms of more transferable work things. So like you might do like a project management class of these kind of things that gets you specific degrees that you then can use to kind of saying, okay, you don't have a specific training for a non-academic job, but you have this degree in project management and these kind of things that might be transferable to different jobs. And in general, kind of like I would say like it's sensible to kind of bake non-academic job options into your research career. So maybe use opportunities for placements, internships, collaborations, kind of side hustles, when you kind of do projects in museums, for instance, or cinemas, or these kind of things that you can put on a CV and then say, okay, no, I've kind of collaborated with these institutions before. But and on a more motivational side, like if you decide not to pursue anything academic after your PhD, that's not a negative thing at all. That's what kind of many people do, and you still have your PhD. So I think that's has value in itself. But in terms of what I just already mentioned, transferable skills, because I personally always struggled with kind of actually just putting myself out there and describing how I would be useful, because you're so stuck in the academic logic sometimes that it's difficult to actually describe what you're good at and what you've been trained at, whereas actually many of us, especially if you've done a postdoc, for instance, and managed your own project, you can it's more about kind of learning the language of the free market on the private sector to kind of like get yourself out there. And that's something universities sometimes train you very well as well. So just watch out for these kind of classes. But there you have analytical skills, you have done event organization and management, you may have done some budget management for your own grant, and you may have what they call relationship and stakeholder management when you actually set up, work with external stakeholders and have supervised students, for instance, or worked with other colleagues on larger projects. So these are something that matter. So like that you can transfer to different jobs, but it's kind of like learning the language of how to communicate that to the non-academic sphere is something that you just should think about in that case. And the last point is kind of just the postdoc sphere can be incredibly challenging, especially mentally and psychologically. So, and that's where I feel like that as somebody who's kind of just escaped it to some extent, it is something that you need to prepare yourself. It is doable, but there is kind of like, because you end up writing dozens of applications and without any response to it, and that kind of like, irrespective of how many people tell you that everything you're doing is fine and you're doing everything right and there's no mistake in whatever you're doing, it is kind of like it can get very depressing at times. And I think and even though it's an economic term, kind of like you need to build up a specific resilience to this, that it's not about you, and that you're not an imposter. And imposter syndrome, I think, especially in the humanities, is something that's very strong, because a lot of our research can be quite, not necessarily personal, but it is an emotional thing to do arts and humanities research to some extent. And if then you don't get any acknowledgement for it, that can be depressing, because like there are times when you just don't get anything positive out of it externally, and that's something you kind of have to deal with, that it's actually not affecting your ability to still apply for stuff and be productive and enjoy the research and the work that you're doing, rather than have yourself kind of pulled down by it. And that's why, kind of last slide, it's doable, but find your right village to support you, and don't give up. People get jobs eventually, and it is a lottery, but it is a lottery that can be won. So that's all for my slideshow so far. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I mean, wonderful advice, really. I mean, I mean it, in the sense that you actually touched upon not only like a number of things that other, guests of mine have already, talked about, right? Especially this idea of community keeps, coming up, right? In the sense that, and here I feel that especially in the department that I'm in right now, right? That's not something that gets discussed a lot, right? And it is very important that you can collaborate with other people, you can have them peer review your work and whatnot. That it may be more of a cultural thing, I think, or a national thing or whatever, right? But I feel that over here, at least, that's still not very much the norm, right? That you're supposed to work by yourself, right? And your advisor, yeah. Right? And you're not really, expected to form those sorts of bonds that you were describing, especially not in the PhD, right? Maybe, in the postdoc, that's, maybe we already know better, right? So we know that we need other people to read our stuff and whatnot. But,
hope so,
but as you were saying, right, like what I think is crucial, right, is that people realize that sort of thing, right, preparing a new project, as you said, right, and making those connections, etc., are all things that you should be doing during the PhD, right? Not necessarily only after you get a postdoc or whatever, right? Because you're going to need those things for the postdoc, right? That's the thing, right? You're going to need a new project. and whatnot. And what I feel is that most PhD students I talk to are so, consumed with the dissertation, right? That's the only thing that matters, right? But it's not, right? Because you have all these years, right, that you're going to be spending on the dissertation. That should be also, you should also be thinking about like getting publications out while you can, because then you're going to be, when you apply for a postdoc, funders are going to want to know, how many publications do you have or whatever. Yeah. Like, are they in good journals? Etc. So all those metrics, actually, are important very early on, right? Not only when you're applying for a professor position or whatever, right? So.
Yeah, I think two things about that are really important. The one thing is because in the humanities we tend to work just by ourselves and not in a team like many sciences do have kind of like lab groups and doing their PhDs together in a project. It is something just to kind of just get away from the sometimes sad life of just being by yourself all the time and not necessarily wanting to communicate every problem you have with your supervisor, or your supervisor might not always have the time for this, and you also don't want to get on their nerves too much. So kind of like having a group of peers around you actually helps you with that, and then you can have a much more informal way of talking about your specific problems, but also maybe just problems of time management and what people think about publishing and etc. But also kind of like realizing that there are other people out there who have similar interests, and you can actually exchange ideas about things. And then if you can, it doesn't have to be expensive. Like, but what I also kind of did then kind of set up a kind of like a small PhD conference on stuff that we were interested in, and then invite people in and kind of like start building a group of like-minded peers who are in a kind of similar career place at the moment, which is much less intimidating than kind of like going to the bigger conferences where you're the small PhD student and sometimes you may be treated as such. Hopefully not, but it's but also for me it was almost like that I was way more intimidated by kind of like advanced scholars than necessarily they treated me like a PhD student. So it's kind of like, whereas I fully embraced the without realizing it to begin with, but because I went to, in the UK, German Studies has a national postdoctoral or no national PhD colloquium for German Studies, which is bi-yearly, and the spring one is always in London, and then the other one moves around institutions. And because I attended all of them and then became one of the organizers of it, I basically know every PhD student in my cohort in German Studies in the UK and Ireland to some extent as well, because you get to meet all of them, and then you kind of like, it becomes something social. You actually enjoy going to these things because you know people already, you meet new people, and you also educate yourself in what's actually out there in the field. And that, to the other part, is kind of the second factor I would like to mention here, is kind of like, because sometimes then having other PhDs or early career people around you is being treated like a competition. That you kind of like, you shouldn't collaborate because you may all be on the job market together, and then you're competing for the same job. So like, why would you kind of like steal yourself or steal ideas from each other? And I always thought like, it's exactly the opposite actually. It's the more we collaborate, the better we get, and also the more you collaborate, it becomes more likely that all the people you like actually also get jobs. So you kind of like, you start supporting your cohort and your field of collaborators, and if you are stronger together in that regard. And you also get more professional. And because I went to all these colloquia and presented my things, my work got better, but I also got better at presenting my ideas and kind of like elevator pitching my PhD to situations where I had to do it, which I would have otherwise been completely overwhelmed by. And then you kind of become more into the habit of what's required for you to present yourself as an academic in a certain career stage, because you kind of like learn it naturally rather than kind of just forcing yourself into it. And I think that's something that has been hugely beneficial to kind of just, so I still do it. Like I have the 10 people that I know, and even if I'm not huge friends with them, if we apply for the same jobs, we talk about the applications together and exchange ideas, because in the long run, our research profiles are so different. And the experience that we have, while at the same time specific criteria, we all have a PhD, we will all have some teaching experience, we'll all have some experiences in other things. That's kind of like the same, and it's the standard requirement, whereas our personalities and our research are so unique that kind of just, we're not really competition. So it's up to the panel to decide whose package is kind of like the most fitting. But in the sense, it's always, in my mind, it's always better to actually collaborate with everyone and exchange ideas, even about job applications, because it actually just improves your work and it improves your performance, if you want to call it like that, in an application as well. So I always feel like even though there are talks about competition, and it might feel like competition, and of course it's not great applying with your friends for the job and not getting it. But also, like if then somebody I like and think is competent gets a job, then I think it's an easier bitter pill to swallow than having no idea who got it. So it's so that's why I feel like the sort of like the social element is crucial to so many things, because academia is exchange, and it is a constant like dialogue between individual study, but then also communicating and discussing these ideas with others. And I think everything gets much easier, but also better. Also, the quality of your work gets better if you kind of like expose your ideas and thoughts to other people who might have a creative response or an interesting critical response to it. And so yeah.
No, I mean, I for sure remember, and that, you know, it's partly why I decided to with my colleague decided to create this series of talks, was precisely because when I finished my PhD, I didn't really have the wide network of support maybe that you have been describing, right? Because we were not in the habit of, as you said, right? Like, as your suggestion, I think, is really, interesting, right? To create, events that are more suited to your own, phase, right, of your career, right? Like with other, other PhD students that are going to actually be interested in what you're doing, and you're going to be more or less at the same level, etc. Right? So that's, I mean, that actually never occurred to me, and that's not really something that I ever did when I was in the PhD. So I always, as you said, right, like I always attended the big conferences, and sure, maybe I got to meet a person here, a person there, but it was never, I never felt that I was doing a lot of a lot of that it was super productive, right? All of these conferences I went to, I never got to meet like that many people, right? So what you're describing, I think, is very useful, right? Because at the end of the day, for example, when I finished the PhD, I finished a little earlier than most of my peers in my year, right? Because I was being pressured by the funder, right? The funder back home to finish. So like I basically I had the PhD, but I didn't have a job, and I didn't know, what to do next. And there was really no one that I could talk to, or that would really understand the state, right? The phase that I was in, right? So I think that's really, really important, right? For people to do that sort of collaboration early on. Yeah. Another thing you mentioned that I wanted to focus on or draw people's attention to was that you said that when you're designing a project, right, or putting together an application, that you should send it to different institutions, right? That's something that, for example, I had some issues with, because when I applied for the IRC that we both got, I had, at the same time I got this position that I currently have, right? Because I did that, right? Like I was doing, sending it to several places. But I remember that, people, for example, at this institution didn't, I shouldn't be saying this, but I don't think they're going to listen anyway. The people at this institution were like, oh, you shouldn't really be doing that, right? That's not very ethical or whatever, right? But that's what you should be doing, right? Like you should be trying your luck in all of these different places, right? And as you were saying, right? Like, there might be also internal competition, so you might not get nominated or whatever, right, in a place, but you might get lucky in another, which is what happened to me. Like my application that this thing that I sent to the IRC and then to this national fund, I had already sent to 2 different funders in Finland, actually, because that again, like going back to the community or your own village or whatever, I knew of a very good friend of mine is in Finland, and she was telling me about all these funding opportunities, and I was applying to go to Finland because that's the only person I knew that was in the same situation I was in, right? And I didn't get it, right? Like I applied for 2 different things in Finland and didn't get it. I got it in Ireland. So that, and with very little changes. So that's another thing that I think is crucial, is that you sort of expand your and especially that's useful for people over here, I think, because people will tend to only apply for things that are funded by the Portuguese government or whatever, right? So
whereas I think, like, I can't speak about Portugal, but I think, like, in most European states and academic cultures, internationalization is something that becomes more prominent and will maybe not be a fixed requirement, but something that will definitely never damage your career trajectories. And in that sense, for me, the same thing. So I had set this project up to apply for various British funders, and then Anne, who's the director of this institute, I met her at one of those PhD conferences because she was invited to give the keynote in Warwick in England. And then she said, like, oh, that's great, like you should apply for the IRC as well, which wasn't my intention to go to Ireland at all. But then the application was similar, and so I put it in for Dublin as well, and then that ended up being the only thing I got. And that kind of like by diversifying or kind of like spreading, because it's so much work to do these applications, I would always encourage. It's not, nobody cares. Like, I think it's because no individuals are really involved in this. So, and everybody who's been through the job market would have to understand that that's just the only way how you get anywhere, really, by kind of like spreading your work and spreading out. And of course, that requires a specific flexibility to move around as well. And that might not be something that not everybody wants, and that's perfectly understandable. But it is pretty much like a requirement to actually move around, and it can be a good thing. So like although I didn't want to come to Ireland, it ended up actually being extremely beneficial for the research that I wanted to be doing. I just had never kind of engaged with it before. And this way you kind of just learn more about different cultures. And it is a flexibility that can be exhausting in the long run, but it is also hugely beneficial for also just personal development. So it's pros and cons if you can do it. But of course, I realize it's also kind of like a privilege to be able to be flexible. So not everybody may have the financial means or kind of like the family situation whatsoever. to be able to do that. So that's also something where kind of you have to watch out where money is actually coming from, and not everybody has that. So that's kind of like a different thing. But so I was lucky that it kind of always worked out. It was always very stressful, but it always ended up falling into place. And then that's how I got where I am right now. But it required me to move country a few times. So
yeah, I mean, it's interesting that I actually didn't know that you got to know about the IRC through and folks who went to a conference in Warwick, right?
She had just moved back. She was still based at Warwick, or had just moved back to Dublin and took the job here, and that's why she was still around, because that was kind of like the non-London colloquia that was hosted by Warwick, and she was just invited to give the keynote. And she's been very successful in, especially post-Brexit, luring potential talent from the UK over to Ireland, and that's how many of us ended up here.
Yeah,
and,
I mean, now I was going to say that the only reason actually I remember I already had the application, all the project was already fully articulated, my project, and I remember that, hey, I did this Erasmus semester in Dublin, so why don't I look for some sort of funding scheme over there, since I know one of the I knew a professor over at the English department pretty well, right? Because I had taken 2 courses with her. So that's how I ended up applying for the IRC, right? So it's interesting to see how, because I see that networking, I think, gets a bad rap, I think, very frequently, because it's thrown around as like this buzzword. It's like almost like you're in the private sector, you're trying to sell your research
synergies and
yeah. And especially in the humanities, I think people really find the word or the concept of it very suspicious, right? But as we're sort of suggesting, right, at the end of the day, that's how you get to know like where the opportunities are, right? It sounds very, I think it, if I was a PhD student and I was, maybe listening to, us, 2 older, older guys like giving advice or whatever, right? I would probably say, yeah, whatever. I'll just keep doing my own thing, and which was why, what I was doing. When I was in the PhD, I was like, I'll just do my own thing. Who cares? I'll eventually get a job, right? But that's actually not how it works. You're gonna need, other people's help, and you're gonna need to know, other people, at least just so you're aware of, all of these opportunities that you won't really, think about when you're on the market, or when you're without a job, right? Like we were, I think.
No, and it's not, and then kind of like, it's not necessarily just about kind of like access to knowledge, because the knowledge is out there, but you may not be looking for it. Whereas kind of like bumping into people at conferences who then say, oh, we've got this scheme, that might be a good thing. And then kind of like that puts that idea into your mind, and you might follow through. Or different people who kind of like, yeah, you've met this person who's at this university, and this other person. That means you can actually enter the internal competition for a postdoc grant through these 2 universities, because it's very easy to actually get in there, because you've got to know them, and you can already talk to them on a more private level and pitch your idea, and it's much more likely that they'll talk to you. And I don't mean this kind of like in a non-personal or unpersonal way, that it's just kind of as a career talk, which kind of you might be looking down at because it's just marketing speech. But I think that's actually part of what academia is as a community. So it's kind of like you always rely on other people's work, and you always rely on other people's support. So why not make it a nice community? and that's kind of one of the things that, apart from the research that I do, is something that I still enjoy the most, because then it becomes a friendly social environment. It's you can look forward to going to conferences because you'll meet all your friends there, and you can go to like whatever summer schools, something that I love, because then they're really like school camps or summer camps with just academics who share similar interests, but they're always usually kind of like socially formative. Right. And then you have a community of people who you actually enjoy being around, and who work on similar things. And these are the people who have met at these kind of events, who I'm now editing books with, or kind of doing conferences, even though they're in different countries or whatsoever. And who will help me write my grant applications, because you need the feedback from, I don't know, 5 to 10 different people for a good draft. And then these kind of things, I don't know, like then I, for instance, recycled the application. I tried a Marie Curie application and tried to go to the US. I didn't get it, but then I recycled it to another grant that was set up here in Ireland, where I made the last round. But then actually, because the job application in Glasgow required me to submit a research proposal as well, that was very easily done, because I had just spent a year writing one and had a full research proposal to submit, which kind of then I think made me stand out to other applicants, because I only had to tweak it for that specific job, but I had kind of like a fully developed idea of what I want to be doing in the next 5 to 10 years. And these are kind of things that just, if you have these kind of collaborations, and if you go to these kind of events, this is something that develops almost naturally, and makes it much easier and less lonely and less overpowering at times as well.
Fun, right?
I mean, yes. But kind of, yeah, so but it's something that's important to me. So like, maybe it's not universal, maybe some people enjoy working more by themselves, but I always felt like it makes then the things that are annoying and hard actually much more bearable, because you can rely on a network of people who will support you, and you support them as well, and ideally all of the people you like the best end up getting the other jobs, and you'll continue working together, which would be sort of like the ideal world.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's very interesting to also hear that you actually, you have a full research proposal, ready to go, when you applied for this job at University of Glasgow. So that's really cool. And so that leads me to, at my next question. I wanted to ask you to expand a little on what you said at the beginning, which I found really interesting, because this is something that I keep trying to make people talk about a little, is about their creative process, right? And that's, I think, the first thing you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation was, what you normally do, which is something that I kind of try to do, but I don't. What you were saying, to have a Word doc where you throw in all of these different things that you find interesting, all of these things that you read that are not necessarily, if I understood you correctly, are not necessarily connected to your project, right? You just find them interesting. You read this article, somewhere, and then you just throw it in there, and it ends up being useful later. And that's something that I wanted to ask you about, right? Like, if you could talk a little bit more about that, right? Because like I also, just to say a little about what I do, right? I tend to also like read around, right, and read this and read that, in with the hope of finding something that is interesting, but is not really within my normal, like, a circle or perimeter of research or whatever, right? I try to find like an interesting so for example, for my, I mean, the example I always give is, for my dissertation, actually, it was a course that I was auditing, right? So I wasn't taking the course, I was really just auditing a course on romanticism, on British romanticism. And one of the assigned readings was about like romanticism in 19th century science. And I found it really interesting how the two connected, and I was like, oh, maybe if I could apply this to the authors that I actually study, right, which are contemporary experimental writers, right? I was like, oh, maybe this framework, right, this methodology or whatever, right, would work really well with this other corpus, of authors. So it was completely fortuitous in my case, right? Like the way I ended up coming up with a topic for my dissertation was an accident, basically, which came out well. I think I really liked what I was doing. So that's normally when what I do to come up with ideas for projects, right? I just look around for stuff that's weird and draws my attention or something. So maybe if you'd like to extend it, what you said.
Yeah, it's like probably several different points here. So I think that the random methodology thing is really important, actually. And I think that's again where having gone to conferences or even just these colloquia actually help, because sometimes then you have somebody talking about, I don't know, even medieval texts, but they have an approach where you feel like, oh wow, that actually would be really interesting to explore for what I'm doing, but I would have never looked there because it's like an entirely different academic sphere where I wouldn't just happen to read around. But by actually going to these things and just end up having an open mind and listening to things, I ended up finding out a lot of kind of theoretical or methodological approaches, or just different ideas with like, oh, wow, they did it back then already. Well, I'm trying to establish this as something from the 1970s or so. And then you start thinking about it in broader terms and more universal terms. And I think that's why, putting yourself out there is always very productive, to just get inspiration where you don't expect it, really. And my PhD and what I'm doing now is kind of similar. So it's a mix of like stuff that I'm genuinely interested in. So my mom would always make jokes that I basically turned all my hobbies into a job. But it's so I've always been interested in architecture and architectural history, and that's something that fascinates me and what I do in my free time. And I've always been interested in theater and performance. And although I trained as a literary scholar, but then was always interested in theater and performance. And then because my master's didn't allow me to do that many literary classes, so I just happened to go to a class about this author Heinrich von Kleist, who also is important, but I've never engaged with him. And then it was really interesting. And then that seminar had organized a trip to his birthplace where they have a museum and everything. And I ended up talking to the curator, who said like, yeah, we have a huge collection of especially East German productions of it, and nobody's looking at it. And so I was like, okay, that's interesting. Why has nobody ever done that? And then I put my mind to it, and that ended up becoming my PhD. So kind of just random, but because it had included authors that I liked and found interesting in and found difficult, and kind of so like, okay, that could be part of the challenge, but also kind of like educate myself in theater and performance. And because I usually enjoy combining different disciplines or different kind of like cultural responses, and find it interesting to kind of like see what happens if you combine them, if there's kind of like interesting repercussions. If you look at literary text and theater, that's what I did in the PhD. And now I'm looking at literature and films and see if like kind of different works of art and as well as an architectural discourse engage with the same things. What happens? How do they kind of like go about it differently? What opportunities does a film have to engage with 1970s modernist social housing? How is a literary text approaching the same thing? What kind of like techniques do they have to make me understand what it was actually like to live in these buildings in the 1970s? But what I did again, that project came about because I attended a summer school in the US that happens bi-yearly, which is dedicated to East German film. And because I was already, as a PhD student, working on literature and theater, I thought, oh, that could be cool. I have no idea about the film scene. And in Germany, nobody researches East German film. And there are 2 people in the UK who do it, but there are about 25 in the US for random reasons. And so I applied, I got funding to do it, and then spent a week in rural Massachusetts watching about 40 films from East Germany that all had engaged with, was about gender and sexual history. But then I realized that all these films kind of do really interesting things with architecture, not only as historical documents, because I know these buildings, but I know kind of their obsolete states after the demise of the state, and where kind of like many 70s buildings in general that just don't look great and didn't look that great anymore in the 90s and 2000s. Whereas kind of watching these films and realizing how shiny and white and modern they once were when they were making these films, but also in the sense that kind of I felt that these films were engaging with urban space in an interesting way. And because I was always fascinated by the built environment and how humans actually interact with spaces and places and kind of attach meaning to an environment, that's something where I feel like, oh, that could be maybe cool. Like maybe that's a new idea. And then I just started collecting my ideas and watched more films, and did what I mentioned earlier. So I had a document in a folder, and when I found an article or whatever, I just downloaded it and put it in there, and then I just developed random thoughts that I had about these kind of things, and I did the same with landscapes. So I'm the other side of that, or the other end of that spectrum, is that I also am interested in how kind of culture designs landscapes, and how landscapes are kind of mediated through culture, and if we're actually talking about real nature or how man-made and how kind of like enculturated many landscapes in literature and films, etc., and visual art in general are. And then I thought like that could be a cool idea as well. And then kind of by the time I was finishing my PhD, I had a collection of things, and I had a first corpus for both of these projects, because I kept on just reading and watching. And I didn't have an argument or anything, but I had something that I was interested in, and I was able to present a corpus of both critical readings as well as primary sources that I was able to use as a starting point. And then I decided that the film and housing topic might be more easy to use in order to get funding, than kind of, because it's more widely usable, especially working on German stuff in an English-speaking country, rather than kind of like looking at 18th century landscape descriptions. And then that's what I did. But actually what I'm writing in right now is I had, through my engagement with urban space, I then found one text that discussed urban space through 18th century landscape descriptions. And then I said like, oh, this is actually about gardening. But the description of gardening from the 18th sounds exactly like the literary text I once read. And then I gave a paper about it at the conference, and now I'm contributing as an article, kind of like as a side hustle, to an edited volume about kind of like cultural landscapes in the 18th century. And this is something like that goes back 6 years and has just been lying about, and I didn't really know what to do with it or how to approach it. Then 5 years later, I found a random text that actually gave me a theoretical approach. And then 2 years later, there was a conference where I was able to present it. But kind of like, so kind of like it aged well. But also kind of like sometimes it's how good projects actually come about. I think it's not that you kind of improvise them, but it takes a lot of experience as well, and a lot of exposition to different ways of doing things that actually make these all kind of like in the grant proposal I was working on. That was actually, I think, then the fifth iteration of that proposal that I had just sent in for different funders. And then I think like actually only the 5th version there were, because then the different funders actually require you to do different things, and that might not always be the ideal thing for the project itself. I thought then only the last one was really the way where I felt like, no, now it's really coming together. Now it's a whole, because the events that I'm planning about it makes sense for the research that I'm doing, and it's actually communicating. But that required several years of thinking about it, and kind of like proficiently as well as randomly being exposed to ways of doing it. And so kind of where I think like that's why I think it's a smart idea in hindsight to that wasn't a strategy that I had. I just kind of like threw shit in a folder. But but then I realized, oh, I can actually, I'm still developing these ideas, and I might do the landscape one as the next one in, I don't know, 10 years. But kind of just that, but then I'll have a completely different skill set of approaching these kind of things. And I've read a lot of things about it, and kind of used an article also to try it out, or I would actually do it as a teaching, as a seminar idea, to try out specific things and discuss it with students, and kind of then make things kind of come together as well if you have the opportunity to do so, because then you have an article as well as a teaching unit as well as a conference presentation, and it saves you work, but also gives you different forums to present and discuss these works. So and I kind of feel like that's how many successful academics do it. So they actually, if they have the chance to actually influence their teaching and what they're teaching and what they're researching, then I think then they actually start one project and put that project into all these little pots, but then effectively only work on one big thing at a time, and then exploit it basically for teaching, for publications, and etc., and grant proposals. And that's how it becomes actually doable, rather than being kind of scatterbrainy around 70 different projects that end up getting nowhere.
Right. No, I mean that's something that you said that I also found really interesting, was that you would use this, document to not only like prepare future applications or think about projects, but also to put together potential courses, right? Which is something, I that's something that never really occurs to me, but that's one thing you can do with your interests. As you explore all of these different things, you could be thinking about potential courses that then maybe when you apply for a professor job or whatever, right? Like then maybe you could offer, as you were saying, right? Like as you were suggesting, you could offer that as this very original very left field approach to whatever, right? Like so that's cool too.
You can even sell it if it's like more like a final year class. Then also you can even sell it as kind of like research in progress, and you're involving your students.
Right.
Not only sell it, but actually do it as well, obviously. But kind of like, but that can also be something productive. So like you have research-led teaching, but also kind of like research and progress-led teaching, where then kind of more advanced students actually are being integrated in your research process and get to contribute or whatever. So it's which is something that I enjoyed as a student, when people did that in an MA seminar or so, and actually you became part of that. I always thought that was really exciting, because you saw like how they work and how they develop a research question, because I think that's something that's always difficult, especially for students, to kind of, how do I get to developing an actual good research question? I think then it can be inspiring for students as well to be part of that process.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you hear, I was just going to say that you hear a lot that you shouldn't be like trying to teach your dissertation, for example, right? But and it sounds like what you're saying and what I'm also like agreeing to is something very much along those lines, right? So that you should be trying to, teach your dissertation, or at least make your interests or your things you find as you explore all these different things, make it the center of a course, right? And so that maybe sounds a little counterintuitive. But I found it interesting too, as you're suggesting, right? Like I always found those seminars. There was actually at Buffalo a very interesting professor that actually the courses that he gave were like the book that he would be writing at the time, right? So he would actually like literally bring the draft of the whatever chapter he was working on and read it to the class, and it was fascinating. I really thought it was because you as you were saying, right, like you do get to see like research in action, right? Like you get to see a new project being developed, right? Like, and the hesitations, the need to correct this and that, or whatever. And you're experiencing also like something fresh, right? Something new, right? So I always found it very interesting. I know that a lot of people like criticized this professor's teaching method.
I mean, it sounds like he exploited you a bit as kind of like free peer reviewers, but it's the like I was gonna say kind of like if I'm interested in something, then of course like it has to be like a class that also provides some value and some universal insight. But then right. I kind of feel like if you read kind of core texts and engage with methodology and theoretical stuff, but I think it's fair to kind of then to be transparent about it, and kind of like these are the things that I'm kind of like asking myself right now. What do you think? And then trusting the students to actually engage with you in a kind of same level discussion. Yeah. And that would probably overwhelm kind of like first year students or so, but I think in the final year or master's level, that's something you can trust them, and then where kind of like then the hierarchies get a bit lower anyway. And but it's also a good way of engaging with finding a good question and finding an answer in the materials, and make it actually more kind of like a research exercise itself that then you can also exploit for your own things. And I kind of feel like you always learn something when teaching anyway. So it's never just kind of like talking at people, but even by just kind of having to talk about something or having to teach something, it's a different kind of like cognitive process rather than just being by yourself. But but I feel like if you can be transparent about these things, but in a class, and make it work in a pedagogical way as well. But yeah, I don't think you shouldn't be teaching your dissertation, especially as an early career person. Like, you need to start somewhere, and you're the expert for that one thing. So it's you shouldn't be only teaching your dissertation, I would say, but I think it's absolutely fair that you shouldn't just be doing kind of like generalist survey classes, but also you start integrating what you know best in your teaching, and then develop it further. But yeah.
All right. The last thing I wanted to ask you was like about publications, right? So how did you manage your publications as you were, transitioning from the PhD to the postdoc and now to a professor position? How did you, let's say, think that I have this really good chapter in my dissertation that would would have the potential, let's say, to make it to a really big journal, something like that, right? So did you even have that sort of preoccupation, or were you just trying to publish whatever was interesting to you? I know that you did a lot of collaborations, right, as you said, right? I've been doing that a lot too. So how did you go about managing like your time in terms of what you wanted to publish, where, that sort of thing.
Like one thing with the PhD itself was that I always said that I wouldn't write it as a kind of like defensive dissertation, but I wrote the PhD itself in book form. So like, because I didn't really see the point in having to revise the entire thing for the publication, why not write it as a book in the first place? And that didn't cause any problems. And that meant that the publication process for the monograph was actually very quick. And I was lucky in that, but it's but because so many people then spend, and to some extent, I would also say waste time, having to basically rewrite their PhDs, where I feel like you need to kind of crack on with other things rather than spending ages. And I mean, they're here in Ireland as well. They're 1 year postdoctoral fellowships for just doing the book. I kind of feel like, yeah, that can be a nice thing to do, but I'd rather kind of just, because I think like at the end of a PhD, you're quite sick of it anyway. So you want to do different things and not kind of go back to that manuscript again. Yeah. But yeah, I think I try to, I think I try to be a bit strategic about these things, kind of just saying, okay, like I have this one chapter that kind of like I cut down for the book, but made it a larger article and then submitted it, and in translation, for instance. And translation is something, if you're able to work in different languages, can be a good thing as well, because then it's kind of acceptable to publish somewhat similar things in different languages, which can be a good way to actually get into publishing and getting publications. So I had kind of like, because my book is in German, but then I basically took 2 parts of 2 different chapters out and made it an article in English. Then that was kind of like differently focused and whatsoever, but kind of like still the same case study. But then it didn't matter that it was basically, it's out there twice in a different way. And then I kind of, yeah, I just happened to become part of kind of collaborative things. So as a PhD student, my supervisors had set up a PhD kind of series or series of conferences, which is still running for any kind of like, yeah, postgraduate working on East Germany, be it history, be it social science, and then run these 1-day conferences in the UK. And then they said like, okay, we should make an edited volume out of the first 3 with a kind of like best of. And then I ended up being one of the editors, and that was a huge experience and useful experience to have. But also something where I would say like actually collaborating on editions is a cool thing to do, because it's you don't have to do it by yourself. And I would like, I'm doing my 3rd edited volume right now with always 2 co-editors. And to me, like 3 editors is a good group, because it's not too much, but it's also like you can have a fairly intimate work relationship. But it's also because everybody's always busy, like, but there's always someone can always do something. And with 3, you have like a good number that whatever email needs to be sent, or kind of like article needs to be kind of like proofread or edited, someone is always able to do it quickly and get the kind of process rolling. And that's something where that I've kind of like, I mean, I always say that I won't do it again, and then I pretty much start the next one immediately. But it's also a way to kind of get into different projects that are not necessarily your own, but something that you're interested in. And you don't necessarily have to contribute an article to these volumes or special issues, but you can kind of like expand your profile in different directions by editing and bringing together and conceptualizing these kind of books. So that's how I ended up doing something on urban environments and migration now, because I can contribute something to urban studies and urban sociology, but I'm not working on migration, but my 2 co-editors are. And that's how we kind of just then I will have a book on migration and urban environments and urban neighborhoods. But although that's not my actual research topic per se, or to some extent, but that's how I will get a major publication out in that field as well, and thereby kind of like expanding your portfolio. And I think that can be a useful thing to do also, but also kind of find the right editors or co-editors, because like you'll be bound together for a few years, and you need to make sure that these people are people that you can actually work with, and that you have like similar working styles, and that's a learning thing as well. But again, like if you already have been working on your village, then that's easier. Because you may already have these people, and yeah, articles is kind of just it's become a mix of, yeah, if you engage in larger projects, and if you have an opportunity like a postdoctoral fellowship to actually delve into a bigger project rather than kind of like doing small things on the side, if you're teaching full time or so, that if you have that, then kind of like I have so many sources now. And I have now an idea of which case studies will make the second book, but I have so many different things now as well, that then if I can see, okay, there's a conference that will probably have a volume or a special issue at the end of it, then you can kind of like pitch stuff that you haven't used, or pitched case studies in different ideas that wouldn't be the focus of your book or whatever you're working on, but kind of like, for instance, like I'm not working on documentary film, but I became part of a conference, and now an edited volume where they're looking into documentary films, and then I realized, okay, yeah, there's a lot of documentaries about construction sites of modernist new towns, and that's how I kind of then got myself into thinking about non-fictional film as well. And now I think it's really productive to compare fictional film and non-fictional film that all use the same authentic environments, and how much realism is actually kind of like how fictional is documentary film and how realist can fictional film be. And that's something that I wouldn't have done myself, but I then will also get a publication on documentary film out of it, although that's not my focus, but then kind of but it's easier because you already have established your case studies and your methodology and how you kind of frame your narrative. And then it's much easier to explore that into different directions or different genres, or whatever these kind of other projects are interested in, rather than kind of starting fresh every time. And that, especially as a kind of young scholar or early career scholar, where it's not as kind of like a self-running system that you're always kind of like part of a project where you have the turnout or result in publications. It's a good way of kind of like getting stuff out there, kind of like exploiting whatever you're doing in all different directions. That can be then an easy and doable and manageable way of actually doing it, rather than having too many side hustles that basically will overwhelm you and might never be finished. So this way I kind of like, whatever, like I'm working on 3 different things at the moment, but they all have the same setup. And I'm using just similar materials and explore them in different ways. And then again, if you're able to write in different languages, then that expands that even further, because then nobody will read the same publication. That's not something I should be saying out loud, but you can do it because it'll have different audiences. So it's
right. Yeah.
And if you can contribute to something that's mostly historians reading, then it doesn't matter that it's the same case study, for instance, because it will still be uniquely interesting for a specific readership that you might not normally get. So where I kind of feel like everything's so overwhelming, and you have to I feel like, because you have to deliver on so many things as a postdoc these days, because there's just so much competition and the job market is so oversubscribed, that you have to kind of find strategies of delivering on these things, but while also kind of staying true to yourself, and your interests and what you actually want to be doing, rather than feeling forced to. You shouldn't be feel forced to network or contribute to something, but you will only get through it, I would say, if you still enjoy what you'll end up working on, and enjoy that you're working with the people you're doing it, but therefore also kind of like developing the profile that will make you competitive, if you want to use the word, but all being considered for something, because it looks like you're actually building a research profile. And you kind of need to think about or develop your own strategy. I wouldn't say there's one way to do it, but to develop your own strategy of how you actually get there, and how you exploit the work you're already doing in as many ways as possible.
No, and I think it's, let's try to end then here. But I think that it's a good idea that I think you both started with, and now are sort of going back to the idea of exposure, right? That you now this new opportunity project that you were mentioning about, documentary films, and not something that you really were working on, but there was a conference and people sort of expected you to work on it, and you just decided to start the whole not a project, but at least a side project in the chapter, right? I think is what you said, right? Like for an edited collection. And that's how it ends up being, I think, right? Is that, certain things you didn't expect to interest you, or that weren't really, in your radar, end up pulling your attention. And that's how you end up developing. I mean, sometimes, I guess, right? Like I've heard of course, you hear a lot about like people that, just do straight, I don't know, medieval, architecture, whatever, really well, and they know their thing, and that's what they do, and they end up getting funding anyway, right? So you even though we're sort of suggesting that you sort of need to have a more improvisational, eclectic approach to these things, that's not necessarily the case, and that's how I think both of us maybe do it, or like doing it, right? That's what I think interests me, is precisely what you were saying, like mixing disciplines. In my case, like, I didn't expect to be working on aging at all, right? Like it's just a good combination, right? Like in terms of the authors that I'm focusing on at this point, right? And the whole like medical humanities side of things is what I find captivating. So but you don't have to do it, right? Like I know a lot of good, very competent, rigorous scholars that just do very traditional projects and end up getting funding anyway. So
and that's cool. I mean, that's what I said, like you need to develop a strategy around what you are interested in and what you want to be doing. And I feel like, to me at least, the more I exposed myself to all kinds of different things, I got a better understanding of how to play the system. So what does matter? Because if you're only in your own institution, you might not actually get the best impression of what's out there. Whereas the more you kind of travel around and meet different people, you will get a sense of what people are interested in, what they think works, what they think is acceptable, and if you collaborate with other people, then that gets easier anyway. But that's where I kind of like, what I like about it still is because I was so far able to build a career around stuff that I'm genuinely interested in. And that's also what gets me going if there's stuff that I don't like, but at least I can always go back to the research that I enjoy and the teaching that I enjoy, because I'm allowed to be creative around this. And that's, to me, the beauty of the profession, if you end up making it work, or happen to make it work, more so. But yeah, that's why I wouldn't say there's one way of doing it, but I think it works best when you get an understanding of how to make it work for yourself. rather than feeling obliged to go a specific path. But the more you kind of get independent around these things, the more you actually, I would say, get a better understanding of how to do it.
Thank you very much, Stephan. And I think we talked about a lot of very interesting, useful things for people that are at, I guess, the early stage of their career. So
I hope so.
Thanks so much. Thank you for your presentation. And yeah,
my pleasure.
And we can say goodbye, at least goodbye to our viewers. Bye.
Bye. See you.
Now we can yeah. Thanks, man. Very good stuff. And I think that the bit about again, like you talked about the creative process and what that's something that I've been trying to get people to talk about, but I think you went into it a little deeper than most of the people that I've had, and okay, I think that
I'm glad. Because it is interesting, kind of like where, I mean, that's why I feel like, because that's why kind of like ending an academic career can be so painful, because it is so personal. So because if you end up doing this, there is a lot of you in that kind of work, and of course we put it up to kind of like specific standards, etc. But it is something very emotional and very personal, and that's why people can be so vulnerable in this position, and so vulnerable against kind of like refusal and negative news and rejections. But it also what makes especially humanities research so interesting, because there is a personal profile that came up with these ideas in the first place, and had probably personal and experiential reasons to ask these questions and then standardize them. But it's but that's why kind of like, and that's why it's cool to socialize, because
no, I mean, what I was gonna, I tried not to say it live because I felt that it would lead us to a whole new discussion, was that yeah, it is all about your interest, but then there are folks that have such, not that they have narrow interest, but their research focuses, let's say, on like a particular author, let's say, or two authors, and especially here you see that a lot, right? Because it's maybe more behind the times or whatever, right? So you get a lot of people that just do that. Well, like you compare this author to this poet to this poet, right? But that's not going to get funding, right? Or that's not going to, it's not going to be easy for you to get funding if you just focus on one author, let's say, right? Because it really fascinates or something like that. So there has to be the other side of like the marketing, let's say, side of it. It's like, what do other people care about, right? I mean, and so there has to be a nice, intermediate position there between your own interests and what other people want to read and whatnot. So, and
of course there's a difference between what kind of stuff gets you a job and what gets you you funding, because then these requirements can be extremely different, and you can be lucky by only working on one topic that's what the department wants, and then they hire you. And I don't see a problem with people actually becoming experts on something specific and niche. But it's that's not the person that I would hire to teach a broad curriculum,
right?
And that's not what I am, because like I would find it boring, because like I'm starting something entirely new every time, because I want to educate myself in it, and I have different interests and I try to make them work. But it's and that's I feel that makes you more successful on the funding side than on the job side, because most funders are more in line with interdisciplinarity new things and experimental things, but it's not stuff you can easily teach, so it wouldn't necessarily make you successful for teaching jobs, and that's why you kind of have to develop all of it. But it's the
yeah, we should be saying this stuff live, man.
I always say, like, I once did something similar like this, and I told them, because it was a much more intimate setting, I said, like, well, okay, like, you're suffering right now in your PhDs, and that's genuine, and I believe you, but it's gonna get worse. And I feel morally obliged to tell you that now, because you might not actually put yourself out there like that if you knew, and you really have to believe in wanting this, and you have to be passionate about it, because then otherwise you won't get through these years, unless you're very lucky, which of course can happen, but I don't think it's very rare that people just get jobs.
Yeah. No, that, I mean, and you know, partly that's why, like, again, I decided to start this with my colleague, because, like, number one, I felt really isolated when I was, you know, starting the whole postdoc thing myself, right? Like, when I, you know, finished the PhD, as I said, like, there was no one really that was in my position. So, you know, and I, you know, went back to my parents, you know, living with my parents for almost a year, didn't have a job, right? So and it's partly my own fault. That's what we were trying to say, right? Like, that you should prepare in advance, right? So you should be preparing a project in advance, should have the publications ready. So all of these things, you should already have them before you finish, right? The PhD. Yeah. So, and right, so number one, you know, my own experience, and second, I noticed that people really don't care, right? Like, I interact with PhD students, and they just don't care, right, about what's coming next. And it's exactly what you said. It's gonna get worse. It's just people don't believe it, or maybe they, yeah.
I don't know. Like, I mean, I'm the person who always kind of tries to create a community around me, but it's kind of. But also, I think, like, the advantage I had back in the day was that I was a migrant, so I was new in the UK, and I didn't understand how the system worked, and I was the only PhD student in my department, and that was actually a way to just also meet people, so kind of like see who's out there, but then also get more confident in presenting your work, get more confident presenting it in a different language, but also learning about kind of like habits from people, and how they talk, how they actually perform these kind of things, and that was hugely educational. But it also means that, yeah, I know everyone who's kind of like in a similar career stage, and that makes everything much easier, because you can always just email them or text them, and then have a conversation about whatever I'm supposed to teach this. I have no clue. I know you work on this. Give me tips, or for instance, that this 18th century landscape thing that I'm writing on, where I feel like I haven't worked on the 18th century for a decade. So I'm really interested in this, but I don't actually feel prepared to write on the 18th century again. But now I know through these colloquia, I know someone in Oxford who kind of does now offer to read it. So, like, I'll write a draft, and then she'll give me tips on how to make it sound for 18th century scholars again. And that's kind of like, I have that because I went to all these things. And same with the applications. So, like, we all apply for these things. We all have some different understanding of the job, and I think end up all with a thorough understanding of what the job or what they're looking for. And then we go back to our individual studies and kind of like develop our profiles around it, and then become very different applicants. But at least we kind of made sure that we all present ourselves in the best possible way. And then we see who's being selected. But that's why I kind of feel like it's not really a competition, because we're not competing. They make a selection. But through this, you can kind of get the best results for yourself, and also make sure that the people who you would want to get the job alternatively maybe get it. And I think in the end, everybody benefits from that, rather than isolating ourselves from it. And maybe some people don't need that and they still get jobs, and that's cool. I would not have gotten anything without the support of many other people who knew things better or had more experience. And
I don't know. We're also, I mean, I speak for myself, but you're pretty extroverted, and I'm also extroverted. So I also enjoy that side of things. But I think a lot of people just don't, and are afraid of me. And I got this friend that is has been in Spain, right, in Catalonia for almost now a year, and she doesn't know anyone, right? Doesn't know anyone in the department, and then although I put pressure on her to maybe tell people that she's running a workshop of something like a film theory reading group or something like that, right? So you got to be proactive, right? Like if you want to meet other people, as you were sort of saying, right? Like if you want to meet people, then you maybe gotta make things easier for yourself, right? Either by organizing conferences, as you were saying, right, with your peers, instead of exposing yourself to this huge group of people in which you're just going to be 1 in 300 or something. But that's I don't know why we would be drawn, why you or I would be drawn to do that, right? I want to meet other people as well, right? It's fun, right? It's fun for me to meet new people, and but some people just don't like it. So don't want to do it. So I don't know.
People still get by. I had this one when I was at Durham. They had several jobs, and then one of them ended up going to a person who I'd never met before. I'd never heard her name, and she had just been doing her PhD at Cambridge, and then got a Leverhulme fellowship, and then got out of that a permanent job at Durham. And she had definitely never showed up to any of the national conferences, never to any of the, and Oxford, they all have their own kind of PhD colloquia as well. So there's the national ones, and Oxford, they do their own thing as well. And many of them just never leave, but and think they can get away with it. And some of them do, and most of them don't actually, but it's the, because you need these networks, you need these kind of supporting networks, and people forget that Oxford and Cambridge are so specific in many things that they're actually not necessarily employable, because they've never given a lecture, they've never actually taught a class of 40 people, and so they're not by kind of per se attractive on the job market, only because they come from these institutions, and many of them don't realize it. So there's a sort of maybe it is arrogance, maybe it's just kind of not thinking too hard about it, but it's where I was it's so odd, and then I was pissed off because they got a job, and whereas we had done everything we could to kind of just actually build our networks, and had collaborated and all these kind of things. But then that's what I mean. So it's, in that regard, it's still not a competition, because you have to be the person that somebody wants to hire, because they have a specific agenda behind it, and you just need to be lucky that you happen to be this one, as I was with Glasgow now, after not having ever been invited for 5 years. So that's why it is a lottery after all.
Hey, but congratulations again. Very nice. All right.
No, it's a relief. Yeah.
Go.
Yeah, no, it's a huge relief.
Yeah, of course. I bet.
And took a while to process. Actually, I was a colleague of mine who got her permanent job last year as well. She kind of said she had basically a tenure blues, because then after she got the job, she was basically depressed for 6 months because all the kind of tension she had built up over the years kind of had to go into kind of a short-term depression first before she could start being productive. And that's how I'm a bit like how I felt in the first two months after I got it as well, kind of where I feel like, oh my God, like it's there's so much tension just kind of falling off. And yeah, so yeah. Cool. Yeah, no, I'm going on holiday tomorrow. I still need to pack. So
really? Where are you going?
I'm going to Paris. It's a much delayed gift that I had given to my goddaughter 2 years ago, and we were meant to go in 2020. And we've settled for this week. And so I'll be walking through Paris with my 16-year-old goddaughter, who's never.
You and is Toby going as well? Or?
Toby's coming as well. Toby's actually lived in Paris. He did part of his MA in Paris, and we know a few people there. And so we're making it kind of like a post-lockdown, not post-COVID, but at least kind of post-travel difficulty, and maybe before the war trip to kind of just enjoy ourselves. And as I'm not teaching, I'm only writing like a maniac. I can just kind of like build around these things and just go to Paris for 4 days, just because I can.
and is it a full week or just a couple of days?
It's 4 days, so tomorrow till Saturday, because I kind of feel like I would stay in Paris for longer, but I don't want to entertain. I love her and we get along very well, but I think 4 days of entertaining a 16-year-old is enough. But I actually, because I still have so much money, and it's the last thing, I'm actually going to the US for 2 weeks in April, because I wasn't able to spend any of my research funding from the IRC, because all the big conferences all didn't happen, or
you ended up not going to Japan, right?
Yeah, and I have to use it until the end of May, and so I had myself invited to, like, I know this one department that I always wanted to go back to in Massachusetts again, where they had the summer school. So I said, like, I have money, invite me to do whatever, and I'll come and then spend 10 days networking in New York.
Well. Oh, you're going to New York City. Damn.
Yeah, so I'll be in Amherst, Massachusetts at UMass for 4 days, and I'm doing this kind of career workshop again, and we're doing Instagram stories around my research, and I'll go to one seminar with her, but it's really kind of just like an excuse to travel, and then I'll be in New York for 9 days in total.
But then that's you're paying for yourself, right? Like to stay in New York City, no? Oh.
Well, I'm officially meeting people at Columbia as well. They're all my friends, but I have a written invitation to be in New York at Columbia, and that's how. Awesome. All the bills will go on. And it's my money. Like, it's like, I'm not stealing it from anyone. Like, why the hell would I care? And my research mentor couldn't give a flying fuck. Like, she said, like, spend it all on nice things. So it's so that's
nice.
why I'm
nice. Yeah, I mean, I was in New York City for just 1 day when I last went to Buffalo, because of the I mean, now you probably don't have to like do the tests and whatnot. That was a whole novel right there, right? Like, because Canada have like particular tests you should do, and then the states have different tests. So I ended up not going through Canada as I had expected. So I went to New York City, and that was a lot of fun, right? So just walking around by myself for a day and a half or something like that. So that was fun, right? Really nice that you're going and that you have money, because that's, I think, what you need in New York cities. You gotta have money to spend,
especially for accommodation, because the hotels are just insane. I mean, coming from Dublin, kind of like, I feel like like restaurants also are not that shocking anymore, because like many of the things are just as expensive or similarly expensive here. Whereas like even kind of like checking out stuff in Paris is cheap coming from Dublin. So so I'm looking forward to that. But the but yeah, no, it's nice that I actually get to fly over for free and can put all my hotels on expenses. And because in Glasgow I won't have a research budget, I already know that, so I kind of feel like I need to.
You're not gonna. Oh.
So that's why I'm definitely doing all the travels that I can right now. Well, I still don't have to pay for it.
It's difficult to keep track of where you are. I actually thought you were in Glasgow already, because you posted pictures.
We went in January to kind of just get a sense of the city and explore kind of neighborhoods. And I met up with the department as well to kind of just introduce myself in person, because the interviews were all online. And but also because we hadn't been in ages, so kind of like getting a fresh feeling of if we like the place and what areas would be nice to live in, etc. But yeah, no, it's they wanted me to start in January, and I'm very happy that I was able to negotiate the summer date, because I'm getting a lot of research done now, which I would have never finished. And that's good also, because the UK has ref. So if I get to do all the things I plan to be doing until September, I basically have my entire ref contribution already done, because then there's so many publications coming out while I'm already there. That'll be good, because then it allows me to actually focus on teaching and all the new job things properly first. And not
is that their tenure system, REF? Is that what they call it?
No, REF is the Research Excellence Framework. So once a decade, every university is being rated by the quality of their research and their output and their social usefulness. And then you have to submit your work and also your events and all that to review panels. And then you get, it's a star rating system. And then depending on how your institute, how your department, school, university performs as a whole, they then get more or less money from the states for research funding. So it's kind of like, and yeah, it's very stressful, because it actually, it's quite, they're getting better, but it's very narrow in terms of what counts as useful research. And it's all the system that kind of disqualifies the humanities entirely, basically. But they got a bit better, but it's kind of keeping people productive and keeping people think about the outside world, which I don't think is a terrible thing per se. But if it means that a lot of niche subjects and historical research is being made redundant because the public doesn't necessarily care about them, then that's of course nonsense as well. But it's a structure that I have to live with. So kind of like, let's keep thinking about it ahead, and how you can pitch stuff that you actually want to be doing within that framework, to kind of play the system to some extent. So
nice, yeah. And you're being paid by the IRC, right? Like still the internship
at the moment, yes. Because I got a COVID extension over 6 months.
For the internship, right? That you
well, the internship extended it by a year, and then I had applied for, because the higher education authority had given like money to all universities so that they can individually fund postdocs or people on research contracts. And I had applied for another 6 months, and then that's what I'm having right now. So technically I'm not paid by the ISC anymore, but by other external funds through UCD. Gotcha. But that's how I managed to actually get 3.5 years or almost 4 years out of the 2. Which
you bastard.
Luck, really.
No, I mean, yeah, I as you remember, I just got out of there as soon as COVID started. So I'm, no point in paying like 800 euros a month.
No.
So yeah, Anyway, have fun in Paris, man, and we'll keep in touch, I'm sure.
We will. Cool. Well, thanks again for this.
Thank you very much. I think it was very cool. Bye.
It was fun. Bye. Ciao.